Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Marcel Bucsescu. I'm Vice President of Strategic Engagement at NACD and delighted to be in sunny and reasonably warm San Francisco for today's webinar. And the city's been a great host. We were in town for RSA and some related events. And it's great to be back with all of you and the Northern California chapter. So thank you to the chapter and all of you for being on today. Also want to be sure to thank Vanessa Ruda and RHR International for the partnership on this webinar. So Vanessa, thanks for joining us, and to
Thanks,
RHR
Marcel,
for your support and collaboration. We'll be hearing from Vanessa later. This webinar is a follow-up to a session we did back in November of last year. And that session was titled Polarization in the Boardroom. This one has been updated to Polarization of the Boardroom. And so we're going to have a discussion about that today, what's going on in the current environment, the theme for this session being, and I don't think there are any surprises here, 100 days into the Trump administration. We were laughing beforehand. We might be a little late to the party with this webinar here. I feel like we've all been at the conference sessions, in the webinars, reading the newsletters. And so what's left to say? Well, actually, there's a lot left to say because, as we do at NACD and in the NorCal chapter in particular, Northern California, we want this to be part of the community where we can share experiences, perspectives with each other and get better that way. And that's really the spirit with which the panel today is approaching this. I think we'd all agree we don't have all or maybe any of the answers. We're all navigating this in real time. And so want this to be a conversation, yes, with the panel, who have generously agreed to share their perspective, but with all of you as well. And as Lisa noted, really want to encourage you to put your questions into the chat. I'll be trying to pull those in real time. You can engage with each other in the chat as well. And then we'll have some time to make sure we address any open items at the end. So really looking forward to it. And I see hello from across the country, which is great. And looking forward to a good discussion today. Again, really looking at how each of you are managing in this environment in your boardrooms. Not going to repeat the news. You've seen it. I think we all know where we stand. And so would rather bring Barbara Adachi, Keith Dorsey, and Vanessa Ruda in. And I might start by asking each of you to say a quick hello and maybe a quick kind of background context on where you're coming from and how you are approaching today's discussion. And Barbara, if it's okay, I'll start with you. You're in my upper right.
Okay, thank you, Marcel, and welcome everybody. I'm Barbara Adachi, and I'm a member of the Northern California chapter here. So I'm based in the Bay Area. I think I know many of you that are on the call today. I currently serve on 3 boards, and I think my perspective today, I'm really excited about the topic because it's not just about the amount of change that we've had, but the velocity of change. It's really unprecedented. So if we'd had this talk, like Marcel said a week ago, it might have been different than today. So I'm excited to hear from everybody on the panel and be part of the discussion.
Thank you, Barbara. Vanessa, I'll come to you next.
Thanks, Marcel. Thanks for having us, and thanks, Barbara and Keith, for joining this panel. I'm Vanessa Ruda. I'm a senior partner at RHR International. We're a consultancy of organizational psychologists, and we focus primarily on C-suite effectiveness and C-suite board effectiveness in the intersection of those two spaces. So we do a lot of CEO succession. We partner with boards in that space. We do a lot of work with boards, intact boards themselves, on their own efficacy and governance. And we work with management teams to help with their efficacy as well. So thanks for having me.
Thanks, Vanessa. And Keith, to round out the introductions.
Yeah, Keith Dorsey, is great to be here. Thank you. And just a little bit about me. I am a senior advisor at a executive search firm called Boynton, and I serve on their practice, their CEO and board services practice. I'm also the founder and executive advisor of Boardroom Journey, which is a board consulting and executive advisory firm for those seeking to get on corporate boards.
And I kind of have always wanted to put it this way, but you've got a new book dropping on Tuesday, right?
I do.
All right. Well, Oh,
called
you've
The
got it there.
Boardroom Journey.
Okay, great. Well, that's a plug. Put it away, Keith. Very good. All right, Keith, let me stay with you if I can, just because Barbara alluded to, and I think everyone feels some of it. There's a lot of emphasis on the speed of change, the speed of information, the uncertainty. Run down the list of words. And maybe before we start, and this question will be to each of you, but Keith, I'll ask you first. How are you doing? How are your boards doing?
I have an assortment of boards. I serve on two private boards, one municipality, one university, and one nonprofit. And they all are dealing with what we're seeing today in many different ways. And as a researcher, I analyze what's going on in today's environment and during the first 100 days and how it impacts the board. And then I also look at it as a board member. But there are 6 areas that I feel that the boards are actually dealing with when it comes to this first 100 days. One is the conflicts over ESG and the commitment there. The second one is divergent opinions around regulatory changes. The third is labor and workforce policies. The fourth being innovation and emerging technologies when it comes to AI and other areas. The fifth is recent executive orders impacting diversity and DEI issues. And then lastly, the disagreement and I'm just going to say disagreement over trade policies due to tariffs. I find that we're having interesting conversations around those 6 areas, depending upon what type of board it actually is, whether it's a SaaS or manufacturing or some sort of government agency or the nonprofits that are dealing with federal funding. So it really depends, but it's something that, I'm glad we're having this conversation. I'm sure we'll dive into those 6 areas in greater detail throughout this call.
Great, thank you. Barbara, maybe I can turn to you and ask a similar question. How are you sort of in the immediate navigating, balancing your energy and kind of efforts?
Yeah.
How are you doing?
What's interesting, and I think I shared this when we kind of had a prep call. We're kind of just 1 quarter in terms of the Q1 board meetings, and I'm just starting now with the Q2. And so it's really hard because that was kind of right in the midst of the inauguration or right closely thereafter. So there wasn't a lot of this happening yet. So, so my point of view is really like what's happened in the whole 100 days and what I've seen kind of evolved, at least in the boardroom, is there is a lot more communication going on between board members, a lot more interaction, just kind of trying to do it. But at the same time, there's a balance because it's really easy to just say, let's just go to this scenario and understand what that means. And rather than panicking and trying to go through every single thing that could possibly happen, it's actually caused us to kind of take a step back and say, okay, let's really kind of anchor in on what's our strategy? How are these things going to impact it? What Keith just brought up in particular around these executive orders, how do we reinforce our own values and our culture to just make sure that we've communicated to the stakeholders, all of them, including employees, a sense of stability in our own world. I think the one thing that has been positive is there has been a lot more communication. And I think that's key. It's much more proactive rather than waiting for the next board meeting because so much has happened. There's just a lot more proactive communication, even amongst board members. And I think the last thing I'll say is I think there already has to exist. And what I've seen is there's already a foundation of trust between management and the board that exists. And so it's not about like, okay, let's take this as board members and think, wow, what's management doing about this? And we're not the ones, the board, it's not in our role to be like coming up with all the scenarios. But I think because of the more proactive communication, I think there's a level of comfort that management is doing what they could do to kind of understand and assess the situation, and then they will present alternatives to us. And so, some yet to be seen because we've only had the one in-person series of Q1 board meetings.
Okay, so that's great. Thank you, Barbara. Perhaps when we come back to it later, as we go into this second quarter, it would be great
Yeah,
to hear how you're thinking about preparing for
yes.
those discussions. But Vanessa, on Barbara's last point, it's a great time to bring you in. She talked about that, one, the communication, two, the trust, the growing trust between the board and management. What are you kind of hearing focus on now? How do you suggest folks approach this environment where, it feels like there's so much there, it's constantly coming at you. Maybe it's constantly changing. We've talked a lot about uncertainty. Any advice on how to approach, one, as an individual director in this environment, but two, thinking about it from that CEO and management perspective and
Yeah.
the work you're doing with your clients?
I build on a lot of what Barbara said in terms of what I'm seeing. There's clearly a lot of angst amongst boards, amongst management teams. It is a very challenging time to navigate. The organizations that I see navigating it as best as anyone can, right? And it's all imperfect, have been able to take the perspective of let's not panic, let's not get into an overly reactive mode. That doesn't mean be paralyzed, but let's not be overly reactive. Let's be thoughtful. Let's remember our mission. Let's remember our strategy. Let's remember our values. Let's remember the outcomes that we're marching toward. And what I've seen, to Barbara's point, is much more communication amongst board members and between the board and CEO and executive team, even outside of formal board meetings. And I think when you look at times like this, dynamics can go one of two ways. You can have some polarization where you've got a board saying, all right, how are you gonna solve this? Right? Come bring me the solution. Or you can really have a trusting partnership where we realize none of us have the answers. I wish the four of us did. I think I can speak for everyone. We don't have all of the answers. And so it requires people coming together in a different way. And so often, and we can, I'm sure, speak to this more as our session goes on, but so often I work with management teams who are, we're preparing for our board meeting next week, and they're preparing all of the decks and things and kind of the dog and pony show, right, to put your best foot forward. And in times like this, that's a use of time and mental energy that's not necessarily as productive as other things, right? This requires less the presentation and let me tell you that we've got everything under control and, don't look under the covers, everything's fine, there's nothing to see here, to much more of an open dialogue. Hey, we've got big challenges. We don't have all the answers. We need the good collective thinking of, all of these very capable and wise board members who bring a different perspective and who can help us come together and focus on what we need to do.
Yeah, Keith, please, on that last point in particular.
Yeah, I really appreciate what Barbara and Vanessa just said. And, over the last week and the next 2 weeks, I have 3 board meetings, and I challenge people to really look at the process that your boards have had regarding their meetings. The average board's supposed to get their board deck to you, 2 weeks prior to the actual board meeting. The average board gets it to you 3 days prior. I would challenge you to reach out to the board and or not to the board, but to the management team to get their proposed agenda to you much sooner, because what I've already found just in 3 boards is that they're going with status quo. And that's the same type of agenda that they have had in the past. And these are different times, and I agree with what Vanessa said, that you have to have time on the agenda to actually have a discussion, a dialogue about what's going on today, whether it's around supply chain, tariffs, diversity language, different things like that. And what I've uncovered just with my own personal boards, as well as talking to others, is that people are on automatic pilot and basically just doing what they've always done. And these times require something that's slightly different to enable a bit more dialogue than normal.
The counter to that, Keith, if I can ask, and I think this was a bit of a learning, some of this folks have compared to kind of the early days of COVID. That might be, but this sort of disruption, change, or at least sense of, is there an element here where management teams are working so hard real time to navigate this, to figure it out, that, again, do we need to have a little bit of grace as the board and not expect or change too much, at least in the short term, while they're sort of settling.
It
Is that
depends. If you're
fair?
looking for answers, yes, you need to give them more time. What I'm suggesting is dialogue. To just have a discussion regarding what are you uncovering, what are you seeing, what are your thoughts thus far, where do you believe you need help from an advisory standpoint with from us board members at this particular point. But to be able to have that sort of dialogue, and most agendas don't allow for that.
Barbara, I want to see if you have anything you'd like to add from this.
Yeah, that's such a great point, Keith. And I think, though, one approach could be, I know this is happening on a couple of my boards where we're taking what used to be like a 2-day meeting, of which we would then have the committees the first day and then the board like half the first day and then the full second day, to now we're doing a lot of these committees virtually to take care of the usual business. And so, in other words, in fact, I've got a committee call tomorrow for one of the audit committees that I'm on. And so then we're going to get all of that out of the way so that we actually will create more space at the upcoming meeting in 2 weeks to have this more strategic discussion, because there's just never enough time. In fact, I was talking to somebody a few weeks ago about this very problem, is that we all love scenario planning, but the reality is that there really isn't a lot of time to do it if when you've got this very structured, tight agenda. And that's probably one of the biggest complaints from directors, is there's just never enough time, even if you've allocated 2 full days or even 2.5 days to be together. And with this kind of environment right now, by the time we get there, the things that we thought we're going to be prepared to talk about could look very different in 2 weeks. And so there's that challenge. So I think by taking some of the meeting, anything that you can, whether it's committees or these standardized things and topics you always talk about, whether it's, this is time every month or every quarter we talk about cyber. Maybe we take that discussion, do it virtually, and then we have more time in person. Because I agree with you, the dialogue and being in the room together and the dynamics, I'd love to hear from you too, Vanessa, just is a different conversation than when you're doing it like this. Do you know what I mean? And people aren't like looking at any other material and they're really in the room to focus on that. So I'm excited for this, one of my upcoming meetings, knowing that we're getting these committee things done ahead of time, and then really saving the time there to use the time to really talk about, what is it that we could do to help the company, because it is still in management's hands.
So Vanessa, would love to get your perspective on that, and then perhaps you could share a little bit about how you think the folks on this call might go about preparing differently for
Yeah.
that discussion engagement. And then Barbara and Keith, the same question to you if we're going to restructure the agenda. So Vanessa, sorry.
Yeah, no. It's and you kind of read my mind, which is it's not preparing, it's preparing differently and spending different mental energy. So, if we think kind of traditionally, historically, management teams are preparing, all of their decks, all of their talking points, all of the information, again, to kind of wow and dazzle the board and make sure that, nobody's lifting up the covers too much and looking for what might be lurking there. And likewise, right, boards are kind of getting that information, absorbing it, thinking what questions they have, what they might want to probe into. What I would recommend, and what I'm seeing, many of my clients do in a very proactive way, is reshape what is it that you're preparing for, right? So rather than preparing for a one-way dialogue, which oftentimes these meetings are, and I'm using extreme language, but rather than preparing for what is a more one-way dialogue, what I would recommend is prepare for a true two-way dialogue and a real discussion and a real kind of problem-solving focus. Materials around the basic things that are on a quarterly agenda, those can be updated, those can be sent in advance, those can be reviewed, but use the time that you have together to really think about being in a problem-solving collaborative space. And I think, maybe I'm grasping for some silver linings in some of the chaos that we see, but if there is a silver lining, it's creating space for boards to truly act in more of a kind of advisory thought partner capacity than they oftentimes have. It's interesting. I'm working with and coaching several new CEOs who are new to role within the past 3 months, really. So, that's a particularly unique pressure coming new into a CEO seat, given this particularly tumultuous times. And many of their boards have said, we really want this person to recognize that we're here to help. We're not here to be the police person. We're not here to say no. We're not here to, we're certainly there's governance components, of course, but we're here to help. We've got, a dozen people around the table who have experience and wisdom and whatever else it might be. And, please encourage this newly seated CEO to use us as a real advisory board and to use us for help. And I think if this opens an aperture, perhaps it's that it's less, kind of management board and some tensions that sometimes exist, and really kind of the mindset of it takes a village. These are hard problems that none of us individually have answers to. And now more than ever is the time to come together to say collectively, we need to solve this, as opposed to, hey, prove to us that you have the answer.
Vanessa, Keith, let me ask you, how are you preparing for upcoming board meetings?
The way that I'm preparing is really going back to the basics. And one of the things that I have uncovered by just going through the motions, we tend to focus around SWOTs, the strength, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And many of these SWOTs have been so internally focused. And when things are running well and the nation and the world doesn't seem so crazy, being focused internally works. But when you think about the whole SWOT side of things, the opportunity and threats are really around external events. The strength and the weaknesses are around internal things, but we tend to want to make it all around internal. But right now, what's going on in the world today from a external standpoint is what should be capturing our attention, and we should be asking different second and third level questions of the management team just to provoke that conversation. And we tend to want to spend our time when we do that around the risk and the threats. But during times like this, and Vanessa briefly alluded to it, there are opportunities as well. And to be able to ask different questions, and that's what I'm preparing for from a board member standpoint, to ask different questions about what else could be true. What else how can we better take advantage of what's going on right now? And to truly ask questions around those opportunities and not just the threats, but really forcing the management team and my cohorts on the board to think about what's going on externally around those opportunities and threats.
Thanks, Keith. Barbara, if I can turn that same question to you, you had mentioned really focusing on this next phase of board meetings. Are you doing anything differently to prepare?
I completely agree with Keith, and I think that
Can you disagree with Keith for the sake of the discussion?
I would never disagree with Keith.
Oh,
So
okay.
let's get that out of the way real quickly. But I love what you said, Keith, and I do think it's around taking it to the next layer, and not because way I look at this is there are certain things we can control and there's certain things we can't. We cannot control what's going on right now with the administration, and because it's changing almost daily, weekly, or whatever, you could just be feeling like bouncing around like a yo-yo, basically, okay, now we've prepared for this and now it's changed to this. Now what do we do? So once you've kind of done your scenario planning and looked at the best case, worst case, you kind of just, that's prepared. So then you take that time and come back and saying, okay, how does this impact our priorities? How does this impact our strategy? What are our competitors doing? Do you know what I mean? Are we potentially going to be disrupted because we're so busy focusing on things that we actually can't control right now? We can only prepare for what's going to need to happen should it happen. So I really think you have to come back and grab control over what you can. So I think as board members, or as a board member, what I'm trying to do is really understand a little bit more, again, around what's the industry doing that I'm in? What's the competition doing? Are they ahead of us? Are people still making these big investments in AI and cyber? Because it's easy to just say, okay, we're not going to do that right now because now we got to go over here and do this. And so I think a lot of it is coming back to what I said at the beginning, which is revisiting strategy, purpose, and what kind of your longer term goals are, and making sure that you don't forget kind of what that ultimate mission is, because it's really easy to get pulled down into this. And like Keith said, and become very internally focused. I will say the one piece of the internal that I would say that we need to pay attention to, though, is the culture and the people. And so, you want to take your eye off of that as well, because that's what's going to help your organization withstand any kind of change that's coming.
That's great. Thank you, Barbara. Vanessa, I want to come back to you with a question that I'm going to try to state clearly, effectively, but so bear with me here.
I'll try to answer it.
Thank you. Well, it's if the question makes sense. It's this idea that I was sitting here thinking, we joked earlier about how we've all read the 100 days. I mean, 100 days for a new administration used to be a marker. And if you got anything done in that period, that was good, right? There was one major piece of legislation, what have you. We're having this call focused in on 100 days. It almost feels like a random at this point day. I mean, we could have this call 2 weeks ago. We can have it in a few weeks, and is there an element here, and it builds off of the last conversation, where people might need to reflect on where are we using kind of outdated frameworks or models because we just always have, when in fact they no longer really apply. And how might that impact the way that directors and management think about approaching their roles, right? So the one that, I'll kind of lead the witness here a little bit, that do we need to redefine certainty so that we get comfortable operating or making decisions in a slightly different environment, right? So are we using frameworks for, I don't know, yeah, finish the question. I think you get where I'm going, hopefully.
I think so, and I'll do my best, hopefully, to try and provide at least some perspective. And this sounds cliche. I don't mean it to, but what was once what we would call uncertainty, it certainly looks to be the norm, at least for the foreseeable future. What feels to all of us, I think, volatile and rapidly changing and chaotic, and I think to some extent we have to settle in that this is kind of the new norm, at least for a period of time. And so when you do that, I am not a marathon runner. My daughter's training for one, much to my chagrin. But from what I understand, if you're running a marathon, you got to pace yourself in a different way. If you're reacting to every bump in the road and every little hill and every right, you're going to burn yourself out. And I think as we look at this first 100 days, which has been a very rapid fire of changes and things that are back and forth, if we're reacting to every single thing in every moment, we're going to burn ourselves out mentally, physically, and otherwise. And so I think the reset or the new paradigm, to your question, Marcel, is kind of recognizing the background of rapidly changing policies, executive orders, et cetera, is likely going to be in place for a while. And so what can boards and management teams do to create some stability and equilibrium, knowing that that's the case, right? Rather than saying, how do we react to it every day? Because we're never going to be able to catch up with that. What can we, I think, Barbara, you mentioned kind of what can we control? What can we control? What can we influence within our own sphere and create kind of a bedrock of some predictability, some stability, some notion of, okay, we're in this for the long run. Day to day, there's going to be some big hills and some rocks and twigs and all of these things, but we've got our eye on the prize long term. Not that hasn't always been important, but from a paradigm standpoint, I think it's much more important and relevant now than perhaps it's ever been, because there is no way to stay ahead of what's going on. So you've got to kind of stay true to your core, and the way I would describe it is quiet, not stagnant, but quiet, right? Kind of quiet of mind and centered in here's who we are and here's where we sit, even in a backdrop that feels chaotic.
Those are great techniques. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Keith.
It's fine, Barbara. I was just going to say I love that whole premise and process that you're talking about there, Vanessa. And I think now's the time to truly go back to revisiting the company's vision, mission, and values, and run everything that we're talking about when it comes to figuring out what trade-offs we need to make, where do we need to focus through our vision, mission, and values. And, we have for several months, maybe even years, been focused around innovation and technology, emerging technologies, different things like that. And it's important to continue to do that, amidst all of these other things that are going on. But if we run it through our vision, mission, and values and make certain we still stand by those, we can make better decisions. I was just at a conference a couple of weeks ago, and a futurist was talking about AI and how important AI is. And he actually said something that caught us all off guard in the room, maybe with a little tongue in cheek. He mentioned that in 10 years, the average company will only have 2 employees. And we just looked and said, how? And he said, because of AI and just the way that it's going and the speed of technology that as board members, we got to continue to stay on top of, they will only have 2 employees, a human and a dog. The human's job is to feed the dog, and the dog's job is to keep the human from systems in place to keep the business running. But in tongue in cheek, he was saying we really have to focus on technology and the way technology is changing our world. And we can't let some of these diversionary flares that we are seeing right now move us away from our purpose. And boards right now need to be more purposeful. And the way that you're going to do that is to remain focused on your vision, mission, and values.
Well, thank you for joining our webinar today. Thanks, Keith. Barbara, I want to see if you have any thoughts there as well. But maybe to pick up on what Keith was alluding to. I mean, there are clearly some trend lines that are gonna, that are flying over the current scenario. This may bend the line a little bit. I mean, how do you differentiate between what's sort of tactical and now and those longer term trends like AI, technology innovation, and the rest of the world? Do you have any way to sort of make structure out of the madness, Barbara?
Well, I try.
That's good.
But I would say that I'm completely in line with what Keith said, because I think I tried to encompass this in my first remarks around, anchoring, on purpose. And I've seen good companies during this period of trauma, and even last year. This is not new information, by the way. It's just happening a lot quicker, and the changing is much quicker than we could have ever foreseen. But we had a preview into this last year before the election. We had, Project 2025 and all these things. We're thinking, oh, this just can't happen. Well, it does. It is, and it has been happening. And I think that what we'd hoped wouldn't happen is now happening, and it's happening and flipping and going back and forth, et cetera. So as boards, what I say is that you still have to come back to the fundamentals. And so that's what the framework that works for me is very similar to what Keith said. And that's what I see good companies doing is let's anchor on purpose. What is our purpose? What is our mission? What is our vision? And then on top of that, then what's our strategy to achieve that? And if it doesn't really enhance this, I heard the CEO of Snowflake speak this week, and he was just really broke it down around the power of AI. And he's, obviously what Snowflake does is really help companies, embrace and implement structure around AI. But he said it really is around 2 things. Is it going to help your business grow? Is it going to save costs? Is it going to drive innovation? It's really around the fundamental things that have to tie back to your strategy. So I think that at this point in time, I feel like it's so easy to get distracted with this and then get pulled away from the fundamentals. And I think, and Keith and I were at a conference earlier this year where we both, share that, this is a time like, even despite, for example, in, the anti-DEI, conversations that are going on, it doesn't mean that you go just now toss out everything that you've believed for many years. We have to just package it differently. We have to think about it differently, but it's still important to get done. It's the same thing around purpose, and it's the same thing around vision and mission and values. Those aren't going to change. So I think we have to just be agile. I mean, I think agility, I wanted to add into what Vanessa was talking about, and just, I love that idea of being quiet and just kind of taking it all in, but not panicking. And I think that that's where we could really help management and the organization and the team, is being that source of stability and not being out there going, well, now we got to go look at this or that. And then they're just like, busy trying to please us. And yet, they still have the business of running the organization every day. And so the more we could be a supporter and not a distraction or demanding things that, just our exercises in coming up with more things. If they aren't aligned with the strategy, then I think we have to think about what works for me is, do we really need this?
Yeah.
And I think we have to be
Thanks.
honest with ourselves.
Vanessa, I wanted to see if you had a comment, and then we'll come to Keith.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. And interestingly, we were talking a bit ago about scenario planning, and it's of course so important given what's going on. What I'm hearing from many of my clients is scenario planning to a point, right? You can spend all your time and energy going down a whole bunch of different rabbit holes around what if it's this, what if it's this, and then something that none of us ever could have possibly predicted or didn't want to predict perhaps happens, and all that. So it's finding a balance of being prepared and being thoughtful, and kind of understanding best case scenario, worst case scenario, right? This direction, that direction, but not getting so distracted by thinking I've got to have a completely buttoned up solution for every eventuality, because we can't know what that is, right? And so we've got to stay focused on what's our vision, our mission, our values, what are the outcomes we're driving toward, what are the things that we know are going to drive our business, and make sure that we don't get pulled too far away from that. And I think where boards can really be helpful to management teams is helping walk that line and helping provide some guidance around where do we really want to be spending our energy and to what degree.
Thanks. Keith, you had a comment you wanted to add as well.
And that's where I was headed. And that was a nice setup there, Vanessa. And I appreciate it, because I want to challenge, and I challenge non-gov committees right now to do some things to prepare for the season we're about to enter. It is what it is. And to prepare for it is to do an analysis of your board members today. And we tend to want to focus on the skills matrix of like 14 different functional skills. And that's really the top 10% of the iceberg. And the bottom 90% of the iceberg that's below the surface are your competencies. And it's those competencies that we don't talk so much about, but we really should analyze. Now's the time to bring the right people in, if you don't have the right people on the board, to truly analyze the competencies. Because what you'll find are those who are most quiet during board meetings of the past could be more influential right now moving forward, because of their competencies under pressure, the different skill sets or competencies that they bring to the table. Because this season that we're entering on the board is maybe a little different than what we've seen in the past 20 years or so. And it's going to require different skill sets and competencies to get through it. And it takes a good leader to recognize what each individual brings to the table, and from an inclusion standpoint, start to call on them to chime in, because we need their help at this particular point. So that's just something I think, what can boards do differently right now is analyze their board members and tap the ones on the shoulders to actually get through what we need to get through moving forward.
Maybe we can stay with that. So I'm going to phrase the question in a moment to each of you, but also want to encourage some questions, perspectives from the audience. The chat has slowed to a crawl, which I am hoping is my internet. So please, thanks. I see a question came in, and we'll bring that in. But let me ask you this question. We've seen a few high-profile boards bring on new board members to really try to incorporate the perspective from sort of the Trump administration, or sort of that more conservative side of the spectrum. And is that something boards should be thinking about doing? How they bring that, ensure that perspective is part of the discussion. I without sort of playing, what's the word for those people that can see the future? Fortune teller or anything, but there is clearly
Futurist.
A futurist. Thanks. Yeah, well, they're much better equipped people to do that. It would help if you know what you're saying before you project the future. But do we need to make sure we are doing what we all say we really should be doing, which is bringing in other perspectives, and important ones, particularly in this moment, into the boardroom? Any thoughts about that as a strategy, without, of course, being overreactive, but.
I mean, I'll jump into this. Conceptually, I say yes. We've spent a lot of time talking. There's a lot of research on the value of having diverse perspectives in boards and management teams, and so this is no different, right? Much like a freedom of speech, right? Freedom of speech means there's freedom for people to say things that you may really abhor and disagree with. Diversity of perspective means bringing in people who have thoughts that may be quite different than your own. But I think the key is not just to bring those perspectives in, but how do you incorporate it in a constructive way? Much like we think about the work of inclusion, right? It's not just do we have diverse people here, but are we creating space where those thoughts can be cultivated in a meaningful way? And this kind of harkens back to the conversation we had in November on polarization and boards. When you bring in diverse thoughts, particularly on these kinds of issues, which tend to be so polarizing and such lightning rod kinds of issues, if you bring people in with those diverse thoughts and don't set up an environment where there can be constructive dialogue, and now you have a divided board, there's nothing good that's going to come from a divided board. It's not good for the organ. It's just not good in any way. And so I would caution very emphatically against that. If you can bring in diverse voices who come with the perspective of my job here as a director is to help ensure that this organization stays true to its values, mission, purpose, stays true to what it's here to do, can navigate strategically to make sure they're delivering shareholder value, et cetera, and delivering on their promise. And if people come into the board with that mentality, and the mentality that, I'm going to present ideas that might open up some opportunities for us, that might open apertures that perhaps we haven't seen, et cetera. And if that can be incorporated in a constructive way, fantastic. But bringing in diverse voices where people are just going to dig their heels in and it's going to become polarizing is not going to be helpful. So I conceptually, yes, but it takes a lot of work and a lot of intentionality to have it fulfill the promise that it was designed to fulfill.
Thanks, Vanessa. Keith, Barbara, I want to see if you have anything to add on that, and then I've got another direction I want to take it. Barbara, you came off mute.
Yeah. So I love that, Vanessa, and I completely agree with you. I think this is why culture is so important. And, the culture of the organization and board culture really kind of sets the foundation on whether or not you could have those kind of conversations. And, if you have created what I would just use for terminology, a safe environment or a safe session in which you could say anything, then you can have that discussion. And then, there's a concept that I've seen on one of my boards, which we called one voice. So we have the debate, but when we leave the room, we are one voice. And we're not going to say, well, I didn't agree with so-and-so. That you say that in the room. Do you know what I mean? Not when you leave the room. And so, and I think that, a lot of boards have codes of conduct. Several of mine do, which in addition, to the things that we all know as board members who are, responsible for the duty of care, et cetera. But it's really around that whole setting, the culture of and kind of, it's not a framework because it's not about rules. It's just really kind of how do decisions get made? What does the debate look like? Are you going to be in a corner ostracized because you've said something negative? Do you know what I mean? Or are you going to be welcome? And then when you leave the room, people are saying, God, that was a great point of view. So I think to me, that's culture. And it really impacts kind of the environment in which you might feel comfortable having that. So when you bring in somebody new, and we're looking at competencies, et cetera, like Keith said, and the people who maybe don't speak up, making them feel invited, but then also when they have a real contrarian point of view, not sitting there going, oh my God, I didn't think that's what you thought. You have to have the culture in which you welcome those voices as well. Like you said, Vanessa, it can't just be, let's bring in a lot of diverse thought and then, but we really don't want to hear it unless it's just like mine. You know what I mean?
One other thing that I would just tack on really, really quickly to that is, part of the culture is when you think about bringing on diverse voices, nobody in that boardroom should be speaking for their own personal agenda, whatever it may be, right? One's own political views, ideology, et cetera. And so when we think about bringing in diverse voices, those who may, have a different perspective or be closer to some of the executive orders, et cetera, from a culture standpoint, I'd be very intentional about saying, our role here as a board is not to, try and forward my own pet project or my own personal political views, but to bring my thinking and my knowledge and perspective that I may have into the board that might help guide and shape where the organization goes. And I think that's a really important piece.
And I think the only other thing I would add here is the word courage. For us as board members to have the courage to speak up. And I think of one board meeting I had 14 months ago where everyone on the board seemed to be headed one direction. And I don't think it was groupthink. I just think it just made sense. And one person, and it wasn't me, had the courage to challenge our thinking. And it was like, 12 Angry Men. All of a sudden, we all just started getting on board with that individual until we were all united around that one person that had the courage to challenge our thinking. And I didn't see that coming at all because it was just about ready to say, this is the direction we're moving. But that person challenged our thought processes. And that's exactly what we need to continue to do. Have the courage to speak up and also, ask what else can be true and recognize that maybe what we're speaking up about doesn't make sense. But what if it did? And we were silent.
Thank you. Let me, we have questions coming in here, and there's a good one I want to open up to all of you, and it's really around outside resources, right? That's a critical resource for boards, your outside advisors, education, etc. The question here is around, you can see it in the chat, so thank you, Kristen, around, we bring in geopolitical experts. Are there other types of speakers or experts that you've been leveraging to bring you and your boards kind of up to speed, ready? Now, it might be short, as we talked about, we've been through one round of boards, but are there other perspectives you're thinking about? And I'll add on to that, Barbara, since you brought up Project 2025, is that something directors should read, if nothing else, to be aware of the full landscape? So Barbara, you came off mute. I'll start with you.
My point about Project 2025 is that we did have like advanced, preview of what could possibly happen versus, but I don't think it's, I think anything we can do to prepare is always helpful. And I think, I think all of us are probably doing a lot more reading than we've ever done just to kind of keep up with the change. But on this topic of expert speakers, I think it's very common now. So in addition to kind of a geopolitical expert, I mean, on several of my boards, we brought in a couple industry experts, even though they're not related necessarily to, because again, one meeting or one quarter, okay, but if even I go back and look at the latter part of last year and preparing for what we thought, could be the new administration either way, we had some speakers coming in to talk about things that could affect our industry. So other outside industry experts, we've had obviously people come in and talk about preparing for activists, those kinds of things we've certainly leveraged, as well as, AI and cyber, in some cases, regulatory expertise in a given state, if you're in a regulated business, those kinds of things. So it's not, I think that's a really good use of time for the board. We often do it like over a lunch or a dinner. We have found it to be really effective to have a dinner speaker sometimes, on a topic, and that way it doesn't really cut into what seems like not enough time during the rest of the day to, be having a speaker. So that's a great idea, though, Kristen.
Thanks, Barbara. Keith, Vanessa, anything you'd like to add?
I would agree with Barbara. The only other people I would recommend are economists right now and organizations that can help us with scenario planning. We have the best intentions. We try it ourselves. We do ad hoc things, but to bring someone in to truly help with some of the scenario planning and scenario approaches.
Yeah, I agree with everything that everyone said. Obviously cyber and AI, the hope is that boards and management teams have some good expertise embedded, but it's evolving and changing so rapidly that, we can't necessarily expect that we're going to have the full expertise in-house. So that would be one other that I would add.
Great, thank you. Let me go back to the communications topic, because we focused in on communication between the board and management, obviously critical. What about communication with other stakeholders, investors, other external stakeholders? Do you think that changes for the board? Do you think differently about that, or are you starting to think about that differently as you go into second, third, fourth quarter?
I think major investors do have questions, just like the board does, around the what ifs scenarios. And so I think being prepared for that, I think is really important to make sure that management is preparing. That's not obviously in our purview to be the one preparing or having necessarily all the interaction. But I do think that with respect to other stakeholders like customers, obviously I talked a little bit about employees. That should have been first of all. I mean, I think there needed to be back to what Keith started with, mission, purpose, values, vision, all of those things. If those things aren't being reinforced with your own employees, I mean, they might be wondering, what are we doing? Right. So I think that's a very key stakeholder and ties directly to the culture topic that I brought up. But customers as well. I mean, but I think, I know we haven't really hit the topic head on yet, but in the area of DEI, a lot of companies have been very vocal about supporting what Trump has recommending. Others have said nothing. And some are just continuing to do what they're doing, just reassuring at least their key stakeholders that they have not changed from their values. And so you see the whole variety, but it's just maybe not as out front as it was. But I'm feeling more comfortable than I was 2 months ago, that people are not just throwing everything out the door or out the window. So I'm encouraged by that, but I just think it's just not front and center like it used to be. And so, but I think those kinds of messages in a very timely manner have to go out to the stakeholders so they know where the company stands.
Anything else you want to add on that front? Otherwise, I'll ask about the broader context. We're focused a lot here on what's close to home, but there's the geopolitical question was on point. Still conflict, war in the Middle East, in Israel, still conflict, war in Ukraine, increased tension with China, on and on and on. How do you balance it all?
There's the $1 million question.
I think that's why people chimed in, right? We got to.
Yeah, right.
No,
you're gonna get the answer in the next 8 minutes.
I mean, is this a little bit of like, oh, this is a thing that's close and we're focused on this, but losing the forest for the trees here?
I don't think there's ever been a time where there's more pressure across the whole globe. I mean, it's really top of mind. But I think back to kind of what I think Vanessa said and Keith, and I've been kind of, really supporting is that, we can't take all of this on. I mean, I think I'm back to like, what can you really control and then plan for and understand what the impact's going to be should X, Y, or Z happen. And after you've done that, you just have, because it's changing so quickly, it's almost impossible to just be that reactive. And I think that, when we had our prep call and everything, we're talking about, how much can you really take on as both a management team and a board to really not panic. And like I think Vanessa, you said we can't possibly prepare for every possible scenario. So I think this is high on the agenda, absolutely. Whether or not we really feel like we could adequately prepare or have a plan A, B, and C, I think is yet to be seen. I mean, and I just don't think anybody's got the answers to that. And it depends on what industry you're in and how you're impacted, with the tariffs or with other things, that are going to impact your business directly, and your business relationships and your customers. So I think some of that, I mean, I think, obviously the automotive industry and others are just, tremendously impacted right now. But, even when you get like, oh, we're going to wait 90 days, what does that really do for you? Other than like, is that the other shoe just going to drop in 90 days? Doesn't mean it's going to go away. It just gives you more time to try to plan. So I think it'll be interesting to kind of find out what did people plan for, when we kind of get through this period and we see what is actually going to stick. But that doesn't mean people aren't doing anything. I think they're doing a lot right now, as much as they can.
And I think it comes right back to the SWOT analysis. we don't do enough of that. And to go right back to that SWOT and say, these threats that are out there, how will that impact our business? And some people will uncover that those threats won't impact the business, so maybe we shouldn't spend as much time on it. Others will show that it could. And these are the three things that we got to be most worried about, and the three areas that we must bone up on to make certain that we as a board understand how this can impact us. But by going back to those external threats and external opportunities, can help us as a board. I just read something just recently. Etsy is expecting to have an incredible quarter because of the tariffs. That's an opportunity because they're bringing more things back to doing things internally within the U.S. So what someone else's threat is someone else's opportunity, but to be able to uncover it and not to try to boil the ocean, because there are an awful lot of diversionary flares out there and we can't chase them all.
Yeah.
Right.
I would just echo, this in the spirit of we can't take everything on. We've seen over the past decade, in an intense way, the role of boards, the role of CEOs are far more complex than they've ever been, right? Because all of you are in a position now, you're not being asked to just govern and run organizations, business as usual. You're asked to be, spiritual leaders and social health policy leaders and so, socio-political leader. The leadership is so much broader, and the range of issues that's coming your way is so much broader. And in the spirit of you can't take everything on, you may have strong feelings and unrest around all kinds of things that are going on in the country and globally. It doesn't mean that you can take that on in your role as a board director or in your role as a CEO or as part of a management team. So you've got to be clear around what is it that we can do from this platform, and what is our remit really. And while we may, all hope and pray and wish for peace in the Middle East, let's say, it doesn't mean that you can do it from the platform of a board chair, right? Or that you can have an impact one way or another. And so just remembering what is my remit here? What can I do? What can I take on in a world where I think the country and the world is so hungry for good leadership that we're looking to corporate entities to provide leadership in ways that we haven't looked to them before. And there's a lot of opportunity in that. But, kind of back to the marathon analogy, you got to pace yourself. You can't take it all on at once.
Well, you all just did a wonderful job with some closing thoughts there. I didn't even have to ask the question. We're coming up on final time. And so I just want to see, I'll ask each of you quickly, though, any last takeaway from our conversation that is really crisp in your mind before we bring us to a close. Barbara?
I would say stay true to your core and your strategy as an organization, and don't where I think scenario planning is absolutely critical and being prepared. You also can't take your eye off the ball of what's important that's going to keep your organization successful. So back to that purpose, vision, mission, and strategy.
Thank you. Keith, anything you'd like to add?
Be courageous to ask the right questions. And as a leader, reach out to those that may not be contributing, because they probably have something that we all need to hear.
Thank you, Keith. Vanessa?
Really look to build and maintain a strong partnership between your board and your management team. It's a unique opportunity to build that and to leverage that right now.
It's wonderful. I'll just share one thought that I think ran through this discussion, but also as we'd all been talking, as we're trying to read, hear, listen more, has actually come up across conferences, et cetera, which is, we're focused on a particular moment of time, whether it feels like disruption or realignment or whatever is happening now. Important not to lose sight that many still feel that as we work through this, the future for American business, for all of us, still is bright, particularly if you are able to do all the things we talked about on this call and manage through it. To be sure, the complexity is probably higher than ever right now. The pressure is higher than ever, but that opportunity is there. And I mean, this is probably a little, no surprise coming from NACD, But we really do believe in this environment then that governance really does matter, and the voice of directors matters as in a collaborative body with management. And so want to thank all of you for your work as directors, and Barbara, Keith, and Vanessa for your time here today and sharing your insights. Vanessa, I want to also really express the appreciation to RHR and the collaboration and support here. And of course, to the Northern California chapter for convening us and creating this space for this dialogue and all the others we do. So with that, we're at time. Thank you all. Have a wonderful rest of the week, and look forward to seeing you at the next NACD Northern California or any chapter or national event for that matter. Have a great day.